Okay, next up on the uncivilized movement list, the Urgrund, making friends with the floor and learning how to move naturally, is sitting. So we covered lying, now we're going to do sitting. This time my point of support or point of contact with the ground is going to be my pelvis, specifically the bottom of my pelvis. Maybe I've got like a balanced sit. I'm on the back of my pelvis, my sacrum and my ilia, but generally, we're talking about those little bony protuberances called the ischial tuberosities that are buried in your booty muscle. That's not an anatomic term, but we're going to go with it. So right now I'm sitting. We used to call this Indian style when I was young in the 70s and 80s, but now we call it crisscross applesauce, I guess. Just sitting like this, I would call this a open, crossed, bent sit. If I were using natural movement terminology to describe this. But the main takeaway for sitting is my pelvis, my glutes are providing my point of contact or support. So right now I'm sitting. Try to stack your shoulders, your head over your shoulders over your pelvis when you're sitting. Although you can be in what's called the tripod sit, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So you can distribute your weight a little differently. Now I'm on just half a pelvis. This, when we get into the sitting, is when you might want to start using some of these bolsters, especially if the old hips and knees and ankles, if you haven't spent much time on the floor, can take a while to get used to this again. A yoga brick under a knee to support that knee so it doesn't drop all the way down and maybe impinge that hip. I can lean that there. I can just sort of prop myself up. Maybe I can't sit down on the floor because my back is rounded because my spine is so tight, I have to lean forward so I don't fall backwards. If that is the case, you can elevate your sit with a blanket or the bolster, just placing that on my pelvis. This brings my pelvis up a little higher and allows me to sit a little easier. Not in direct contact with the floor, but my pelvis is still my point of support. So you can practice sitting like this, playing on your phone, answering email or texts, reading a book, drawing, playing with your kids, just resting. Sometimes it feels good just to sit down. You can spend your contemplation hour like this a day. In Uncivilized Vitality, we talk about the golden hour. That's when you spend 1 hour in solitary reflection, sitting on the floor, especially outside. Then you get all the goodness wrapped up into 1 hour. Otherwise, break this up into pieces throughout the day. Get down on the floor and sit as often as you can. This will start to loosen up those tight low back muscles. Those hips are starting to loosen up just by sitting here. And the best part about sitting down is if I sit in this position long enough, I start to feel the urge to move. This is why little kids squirm. They're more in touch with their innate needs physically. When you have to move, right, I get a little uncomfortable. I'll maybe stretch my legs out in front of me. Now I'm in what we call a long sit. So my legs are just straight out in front of me. And then there's just some terminology. This would be a closed long sit. If my legs were opened up, this would be a long open sit because my legs are apart. If this is the open sit, if I were to bend my knees, now I'm in a bent sit. I can get in a nice deep bent sit and grab my knees. Oh, I'll stretch my back out. Sometimes that really feels good at the end of the day. I can be in a half bent, half long sit. This is just terminology we use to describe these. But changing positions often is good when you're on the ground. I might even get tired of sitting and want to lean back on an arm. This would be more of a supported, a reclining tripod split sit, but we don't have to learn all those terms right now. Just get down on the ground and practice sitting in different positions while you do things. Move your feet around. One in particular sitting technique is called the side bent sit. So I'm in a bent sit and I'm going to drop my legs, drop my knees to the side. So what I end up with is this also called a box sit or a 90-90. There's lots of different terms for it. But what we really get is the benefit of one internally rotated hip and the opposite hip externally rotated. And this is one where you might really want the bolsters. You can't get this hip down. If you find yourself with the back of this pelvis off the ground when you're doing it, it's because the front of the hip is too tight and you can't sit up and let that hip drop down in there. You can experiment with the position of your foot and ankle out to the side like this. Puts a lot of torque on the knee. It might be more comfortable to tuck that foot and ankle back in line with the leg. Remember this from high school called the hurdler stretch? And they used to tell you it was bad for your knee. It's bad for your knees if you jump right into it and you haven't sat on the floor for a while. But once you get a little looser and you hit one of those, like those little W sits, like, little kids drop into a W sit, I wouldn't recommend doing that right away, especially if you're over the age of 35. That can be somewhat uncomfortable. But get down, practice your different sitting. When you feel ready, drop those legs off to the side and come into your side bent sit. A great way to continue loosening the hips up with your sitting techniques is maybe go in a long sit and rock and rotate those hips. And when you've moved into this side bent sit, is practice doing a side bent sit reverse. So I'm going to recline back on my hand, keep my feet in position, bring my knees up, and rotate them to the other side. Okay? So as this right hip is internally rotated, as I bring those knees up and across, now it turns into the external rotation position, and the other foot is there. Once you get better at that, you can practice staying upright and bringing your body across without leaning back on your hands. You could practice putting the foot out, the other foot, and reverse them that way instead of swiveling across. Right? And then while you're in this position, the side bent sit, you can lean forward to read a book, or you can stretch and reach and look around, and lots of ways you can turn this into a mobility exercise. Otherwise, it's just that piece of grass. Just sitting on the floor, the side bent sit, the long sit, the crossed sit, crisscross applesauce. I can just move through these different ways of sitting. Sometimes I can go back to the other video and just lie down. Right? So check that one out. All right, so that is sitting, just a few transitions, a few of the specific sitting positions. Next up is kneeling.